digital cash, central bank money. What about the idea, instead of banks making these local loans to individuals, that the central bank might have an account for everybody and have some money into it, and they can loan out from those accounts without going through local banks? Any thoughts?
Either way, whatever is most convenient. I thought it would be convenient for people to deal with the banks they're accustomed to deal with, but if we have a digital currency and everybody already has an account at the central bank, why not?
Okay. Quick question.
Have you seen the proposal that Yanis Varoufakis did for Greece with respect to tax credits?
No, I haven't.
Oh, well, you'd be very interested. It's different because it's within the EZ system, but there's a lot of similarities.
Yeah. Well, let me say that this relates to the idea of the optimal currency areas, which goes back to the 1960s. I'm trying to remember my teacher at the University of Chicago who wrote about optimal currency areas. It's not coming to me at the moment, but anyway, the European Union, or the Euro area, is much larger than an optimal currency area. So if I were to apply this idea to Europe, I think I would have to say that to the extent that you have different economic conditions in different countries, you'd want to have different loans in different countries and lend money to people in Greece and Italy and Spain when you weren't lending the money to people in Germany.
Yeah, there's two Italian professors are advocating the same thing in Italy as an Italian system. So the same with the Greek. Is Greek taxes versus Italian taxes or Portuguese versus?
Last question, Paul.
Okay, I just, maybe it's a general question or comment, that it seems to me that there is a presumption that under the Need Act, for instance, politics would remain the same. That all the incentives and disincentives that government sees now would exist after the Need Act. I don't think we really know. It's never been tried. And it could be that government might be a lot more accountable and honest than it is now when some of these disincentives are no longer there. So it's just, I think we're presuming a little too much.
I'll leave that comment at that.
Thanks, Nick. Please give Nick a great round of applause. And I was going to say in your introduction, Nick always makes you think really hard. I was at the first conference where he brought up the BRIC standard, and it took me a while to get my head around it. But whatever Nick suggests, there's always a strong logic behind it. So thanks again, Nick. And now I'd like to introduce our next speaker. We've got to switch around between Manuel and Doug Arend, because Manuel's staying here and Doug has to get away. So I got, somehow something came up on my computer, and I followed it up, and I got in touch with this person in Australia, and he sent me a link to Doug, and he said, well, he's a lawyer working in our area, which is cryptocurrencies, and we're making a sort of a bit of a feature of cryptocurrencies into this conference, because it's something that well, I've been looking into for the last year. Like I was saying, I think it's very interesting. There's a lot of potential, and there's it really requires all of us to sort of think differently. Like Nick requires us to think differently, so do cryptocurrencies. So I managed to, because Doug's based here in Chicago, it's relatively easy for him to get here. So he very graciously offered to come and just talk a little bit about some of the legal aspects of cryptocurrencies. We were wanting to sort of get someone to talk about the accounting side of it, but like I said before when I was talking about Bill Bergman, we found that if we couldn't get accountants to answer our questions, then the lawyers, that's where the rubber hits the road, is the law. So that's basically the ultimate litmus test, is the law. So please give a warm welcome to Doug Arend. Thank you.
thank you all very much. Let me say two things. First, it's a pleasure to be here. I very much appreciate Jamie reaching out and giving me the opportunity. Although I will tell you that following up a speaker who studied with Milton Friedman sets a pretty high bar. So I'll reserve my total thanks after I have a chance to talk to Jamie regarding the sequencing of the evening's events. As Jamie mentioned, cryptocurrencies and the tokens and every other term that you hear in this space get passed around, bounced around, in one fashion or another, used, misused very frequently. So what I'm going to try to do is give a very brief, very general kind of overview to the topic area, and particularly the work that I do in the space, practicing in cryptocurrencies, with kind of three different basic themes. To talk about cryptocurrencies devoid of the underlying blockchain technology, which is the secret sauce, the computer algorithms, and if you will, the replacement for the government behind cryptocurrencies. Since these are not fiat, these are not issued by, backed by full faith and credit of any government, they basically exist and function because the people who use them trust them. And they trust them because of the underlying technology. So I'll spend a few minutes just kind of very quickly giving you an overview to the technology behind the cryptocurrencies. A little discussion on cryptocurrencies themselves, and then this notion of the digital token. Again, sometimes the terms are used synonymously, but I'll make every effort to just try to get through these and give you a sense as to how they occur in the industry and the issues that they generate. The blockchain technology, sometimes called distributed ledger, is the basis on which cryptocurrencies are, one, created, and are two, exchanged. When you're trying to establish some medium of exchange devoid of government oversight, intervention, or really any direct role, the blockchain is the substitute. It's a methodology whereby the users of the coin, the cryptocurrency, can effectively see every transaction that occurs, and the ones that have sufficient computing power can basically validate or invalidate the transactions so that there is no government monitor. There is no government oversight. The government does not issue. The government does not monitor the transaction. Well, they may monitor thanks to the IRS, but the government monitoring does not affect the transfer of the currency, the way it's exchanged, how it's used. All of those events can occur separately and outside of any government intervention, which was the basis really on which the system was originally proposed and developed back in the late 2000s. The concept of cryptocurrency is simply a digital fingerprint. It is a way to track what the users believe and attribute to value in a way that's freely transferable, totally transparent to the users, and is not subject to any central control. There's no bank that has the ability to use the reserve ratio or some other such methodology to increase the supply of money, because there's no bank involved in the process. So if you're looking for a way to create some kind of a medium of exchange without having a private, if you will, entity or a series of private entities being able to manage the marketplace and the currency, cryptocurrency really does fall into that category. And you'll hear various technology terms used, different cryptocurrencies. The ones that I think today are probably the most widely known are Bitcoin and Ether. But there are a host, there are literally thousands of Bitcoins. If you want to sit at your computer with the appropriate software, you can create your own cryptocurrency. And then if it's accepted and used, you can use that as a medium of value, again, without any kind of government intervention or action. And just to give you kind of a very brief visual of how a blockchain operates. There are various steps. There's the transaction between two parties, which is like any other instance of commerce, how most of these systems would begin. But now the question is, how do the parties accomplish a payment mechanism rather than using credit cards or wire transfers or some other means of effectuating a payment transfer between remote parties? Well, essentially that's where the three processes, encryption, validation, and distribution, come into play. And again, technologically, the kind of key takeaway from this is there's no government entity, there's no government role, there's no centralized role. Whether it's a central bank or a series of commercial banks, nowhere in this transaction does any of that appear. And that really was one of the driving forces. When the original blockchain technology was first introduced in 2008 and 2009, it was in response to the financial crash in 2008 and the fear that that could precipitate failures in governments, which would then follow into failure to the currencies that the governments generated. And so the kind of key takeaway here is not as much the specific details of how the transaction works as it is you have a completed transaction, fully transparent, validated in a way that required no government to create currency or to monitor how the transaction takes place. And there are terms that you'll hear, and I just want to kind of point to, in addition to the terms that I've kind of referenced, smart contracts are something that you'll hear about, which again is an offshoot of the blockchain technology. The idea behind a smart contract is parties can literally agree to some kind of commerce, some kind of transaction that they can essentially self-enforce, that the contract will actually be the methodology, again, through the blockchain, that allows the parties to confirm when the party that's delivering a good has made the delivery, and therefore when the party that's responsible for paying for the goods has to make payment. So the concept behind the smart contract, behind the blockchain, again, is to figure out some way that you can have transactions, traditional buyer-seller transactions, occur without any kind of centralized oversight or authority to maintain them. Now, from my perspective, on the legal side, because as Jamie mentioned, I'm more involved on the law than I am on the accounting, that creates a variety of issues, both state and federal, in terms of how do you allow parties to conduct this type of activity without potential fraud, without some other advantage that one party would take on the other, because again, there is no centralized overseer. You can't go to your bank if there's a problem with a blockchain transaction or a cryptocurrency sale, because the bank says, well, we don't deal in cryptocurrencies. So we're not in a position to intercede on your behalf. If the money was stolen from your ATM, your bank can take a position. They can't do that in a world where they had nothing to do with the creation of the currency or the maintenance of the currency. And so a lot of what we're doing, and still very much evolving, although the cryptocurrencies now are enjoying roughly a first decade of life, I always tell people that even without new technology, the law is usually about 5 to 10 years behind reality. And in the case of an emerging market like cryptocurrencies, it's probably twice that far behind. So as a result, a lot of the regulations, both here in the US, in the EU, and in Asia, which are the three primary dominant theaters in which some form of electronic commerce or cryptocurrency is so far been used, are still very much evolving. I tell clients if they call at 8 o'clock in the morning, call me back at 4:30, because they could well have changed between what then and now. And that's not an exaggeration. It really is the case that we're seeing situations where US regulators who will be at conferences like this will make a statement, and the next thing you see in the news is that becomes the new policy from the regulator, without any of the traditional processes that would normally be followed to adopt regulations. Now it's the informal comments of the regulator that become law because things are happening so quickly, the regulators don't have time to go through the normal process. Few quick fun facts, just to kind of keep things a little bit in context. Originally, although the name Satoshi Nakamoto, which most people consider is probably a pseudonym for a group of developers, first launched the initial public disclosure of this distributed ledger or blockchain technology, it was done primarily in the context of developing a system for gamers to be able to exchange value back and forth in online games that they were playing, with no real intention to create some kind of a substitute for a fiat commodity or fiat currency. And just in comparison, and there's many references that you could make to this, that the cryptocurrency market has caught on with such fever in the past few years that in 2010, the 10,000 bitcoins that a programmer paid for one pizza would be somewhat more than that today, since Bitcoin closed this afternoon at about $6,400 a piece. And so it really shows that the technology may have significant distance to run from where we are today, just because there's no way to predict how quickly or how extensively there's going to be continuing development in this area. A few other interesting points that I wanted to bring out in comparison to traditional fiat or government currency. And the first being is that once you've established a particular coin, again, Bitcoin I'm using as a proxy for any of these, unless there's unanimous consent, which in the case of Bitcoin now there are millions of people that are transacted in it, which would make consensus unanimously almost impossible, the number of Bitcoin cannot be increased. So if you are concerned about some type of manipulation, if you will, of monetary policy or otherwise, that could result in commercial banks effectively being able to increase the supply of available money. In the case of a cryptocurrency, that cannot be done, because without unanimous consent, the users have established the total known value. Now, that doesn't mean that the combined market cap can't significantly increase, but the number of Bitcoin themselves, as is true for any of the other currencies, cannot be manipulated, cannot be, again, with no central authority involved, increased artificially without consent of all the users. And it's that consent of the users that really is kind of the point that I wanted to drive home more than anything else. Because the users are the ones in a cryptocurrency environment that really establish how the coin is going to be used and how it can be used. There are headlines that you see in the markets are probably nothing that you need pointed out, because if you read any financial paper, you see that on almost a daily basis. The volatility in the market is extraordinary, there's no question. But this is also very much an early stage, initial market, where many people are still trying to figure out exactly what it means, how do you transact in the currency. But it shows, I think, to some extent, the, if you will, maybe uncertainty, or if not, just the extent to which a limited number of participants, which in many of the currency cases still applies, can have a significant impact on the market. And again, I'm just going to kind of quickly run through, give you a few examples of some of the recent news articles that have come out, just showing kind of what can happen in a new stage technology when people are unfamiliar with it and have questions. And again, we're only 10 years in. 10 years from now, I suspect everything that I'm kind of laying out today will become either outdated or anecdotal or irrelevant, because the technology will again have evolved. We're talking about a technology based on a platform from 10 years ago. Well, Moore's Law would tell you that if nothing else, the technology today is such that you should be able to develop an entire new methodology that would eclipse what was in place when this technology was developed. But again, at this stage, we're still working on a 10-year-old technology, which means probably a 20-year-old set of US regulations. And the regulations divide into basically 4 camps. At the federal level, you've got, again, a variety of agencies. Department of Justice, Securities and Exchange Commission, the US Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and the Department of Justice. High degree of overlap between these various agencies. There's also a large amount of separation, where one agency will simply defer to another, again, because we're in an early stage where there is no statutes. The law is dictated, if not by the regulations themselves, by, as I mentioned a few moments ago, by the informal, off-the-cuff comments by regulators at conferences. Given that there is a regulatory uncertainty that overplays the economic uncertainty in the markets, all of which compound to suggest that it is, I think, safe to say far too early to try to make some determination as to the long-term viability of the cryptocurrency market, particularly in connection or in comparison or contrast to fiat currency, but the underpinnings behind it, the lack of centralization, the inability of some central authority to artificially or autonomously increase the total amount of currency in circulation and such, speak to some very legitimate, I think, sound economic principles, suggesting that the concept of the cryptocurrency is something that should have continued viability, even as we see these various regulatory issues and uncertainties hopefully being kind of worked through. And part of that turns on the fact that you ask someone, well, what is a cryptocurrency? Someone might say, well, I went out and effected a transaction. I bought a computer, I bought a laptop from a provider, and I used cryptocurrency. So to me, it's a medium of exchange. You might ask someone else, well, what's cryptocurrency to you? And the person said, well, I was one of those people who had the foresight to buy it when it was $50 a piece, and now that it's $6,400 a piece, it's the best investment I ever made. So they don't think of it in any way as a medium of exchange. For them, it's an investment, it's an asset class. Again, until we start getting some better guidance as to what it is, or can it function in both, and clearly up till now the answer is that it can, we're not going to see regulations that will necessarily further limit the practice, but that's okay, because the people who developed the cryptocurrency concept in the first place wanted it to be separate from any ability of a government to come in and somehow set up controls, restrictions, limitations, because it was a fear of government collapse that led to the creation of the cryptocurrency in the first place. There's a variety of regulatory bodies, as I mentioned, in this space. One that I honestly did not have much dealing with before getting involved here in this space. My practice has always been focused on the SEC and the CFTC, is the FinCEN department of the Department of Treasury, which has gotten very actively involved in this space, and in some cases more actively involved than the courts will permit it to. It's lost a few cases where it's tried to step in the last couple of years to establish a regulatory framework under the basic premise that the cryptocurrencies were not created through an arm of the government, and therefore the government's ability to regulate them is and should be kept limited. And I think this is a point that Jamie and I had some discussions on before. It's interesting to see that unlike the dollar or the euro or the yen or any other particular government currency that you may be looking at today, you've got very much a global approach, because wherever two computers are located in the world, they can effectuate an exchange using cryptocurrency. So the next question becomes, all right, well, if two regulators intend to claim jurisdiction, do they both have the right? Does one have the right and not the other? And clearly these are unsettled and unanswered questions at this point. But I find it interesting just to very quickly take a look and see how the approach has been differed to some extent between the US and particularly between the EU. That the concept of the EU is coming, I think, more online and faster than in the US, recognizing a cryptocurrency is kind of a pure asset, because there's no issuer obligation, there's no government behind it. Therefore, when a cryptocurrency is created, it's essentially a new asset without any corresponding liability. And so the EU and its member states has really, I think, been working very diligently, particularly in the past couple of years, to try to create a regulatory framework as cryptocurrency transactions occur across member states in the EU and such, really to determine how the EU can regulate without regulating the cryptocurrencies out of their main focus. I think the EU very much has been kind of centered on that we believe that there's some regulation that should be imposed, not sure exactly what, and we don't want to do it in a way that's going to impede the development of the market. I think that's been a very positive sign, because it shows that a sensitivity to regulation exists, but not to the point where the EU is trying to eliminate the ability of transactions to be effectuated through a cryptocurrency approach. And again, appropriately I think, in many of the EU countries, their approach is one of cautions and warnings. If the regulator believes that they've taken appropriate steps to advise and to inform the citizens of the EU about the potential risks and concerns of using the currency, they then let the users decide for themselves if they want to accept the risks, as opposed to the government stepping in and telling the users whether it's a risk that they should or should not be subjected to. And I want to just kind of very quickly differentiate the idea of the coin offerings, or the coins themselves, from tokens and the notion of a coin offering. Because as you look through the various stages of a new coin's lifespan, the initial existence really is the case where you think about, where does this coin come from? There's no government that issues it. It doesn't exist previously, and yet through the use of the digital technology and the blockchain, it gets created, all right? But then how does it get distributed? Well, one person or a small group make the underlying development, which then, as the coin begins to become available in commerce and is used more and more, eventually will or will not become adopted. But the real kind of underlying principle here is, when you convert a new idea from one person's computer to maybe 1 million computers over a short period of time in some instances, how is that underlying coin changed? Well, the securities laws and the laws in this country will say that generally you begin as a security, and that morphs into a commodity, and at some point that becomes a form of currency. The EU's approach, somewhat different again, is they're looking to really set up a single standard and not treat it or view it as a single entity that over time changes its complexion. For those of us that practice in financial services, though, it's a both fascinating and extremely difficult concept, because when you tell a client, when they ask a question, well, you may be asking a question about a security, or you may be asking a question about a commodity, or about a currency. And it kind of depends on where we are in the life cycle as to which of those three incarnations are appropriate. It becomes very difficult for people to say, so what regulatory regime am I under? And again, the thought is, over time, as we get test cases, as we get precedent, as we get, in some cases, regulations, that will begin to give us some greater clarity on this. We think that it's going to be ones that will eventually work themselves through the process. And this just kind of, again, is a very brief summary of, in this case now, the US regulators, and the number of acronyms that are out there between all the regulatory authorities at the federal level and at the state level that are regulating the space, and in some cases are engaged in a turf battle, where they're trying to literally fight each other to have regulation over a new area, because they don't want this to be something that they cede the authority over without at least a fight. And I guess to kind of illustrate that point, this just gives you a little bit of a sense of the current state, and this is earlier this year that we prepared this, but the current state of kind of uncertainty regarding licensing dealers in cryptocurrencies just among the US. And you can take this same approach, you can turn it into a global view of EU, of Asia, and you'd see the same type of different approach being taken in different jurisdictions. And I have no doubt that even though this is only a couple months old, there will probably be at least 3 or 4 states that would change their color if I updated the chart to today, again, just because this is such a constantly changing and frequently revisited area. I've spoken to several regulators who I've questioned to say, well, I spoke with you 6 months ago and your opinion was this. Is that still your opinion today? And many times you get an equivocation. where they come back and respond, well, that was my opinion then, I need to think about what my opinion now is going to be, because it may well change. And so I think, again, all of these uncertainty elements weigh into the fact that in time, assuming the market continues to mature, the uncertainty and the risk element will contract, and we'll have a better established body of law for the various parties that are engaging in these activities. Again, there's kind of a host of differentiations and issues. The token, which is kind of, I like to say, the entry pass. It's the way to get into various technologies that are using cryptocurrencies kind of as an internal development tool. And it's a way, much like you'd have a pass to an arcade or something, to an entertainment event. The tokens are the way that you can access the technology that's being used. If you want to play in a particular game, you need the token to give you the access, and the token itself is created and issued as part of the blockchain process. So again, the intention is that with the computer, you've got the complete facilities that you need. However, the developer may have intended it to literally create an entire transactional regime, an entire economy, if you will, without any form of centralized intervention, centralized control, and that really is kind of the ultimate objective that was set out a decade ago, and we're seeing it, I think, today, hopefully somewhat brought to fruition. And so, I think probably in conclusion, and I say that more than happy to take any questions that you might have, but I think in conclusion, the real idea behind the technology and behind the use of the cryptocurrency is it's an alternative to government-issued fiat currency, and in that alternative, it creates many different both potential opportunities and risks that the market and the various economies that are using the technology are exploring and hopefully will help resolve over time.
Thank you very much, Doug. That was an outstanding overview of this new area to a lot of us. And I'm sure there's lots of questions, so if you can stay on for a little bit and take as many as we can. Thank you.
I have a very naive question, and that is, you talked about the validation of a transaction. It could be carried out by users if you have enough computer power.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
What is a validation? Is it just to say that something occurred, or is it more to it than that?
It is to say that something occurred, but embedded in that statement are several different stages. Because, for example, for something to have occurred, there must be at least three things that happened. Number one, the buyer must have had the currency available to him or her before they could make the purchase. So the first thing to validate is that the buyer, in fact, has the money. The second is that the buyer, in fact, intended to transmit this money to the seller. And the third is that, in fact, the money was transmitted. And all of those are aspects of the validation. And essentially the way it works is it's used as what's known as an encryption key. The methodology, the technology, if you will, behind the blockchain is that a transaction between two parties is tentatively posted, but embedded in the system, in the technology, is essentially an authentication protocol. What it really amounts to is an algorithm. The algorithm is tied in to the amount of Bitcoin or other cryptocurrency the buyer has, and the amount that intends to be transferred in this transaction. And the validation process is to basically run through the computer algorithm to determine whether or not, in fact, the three conditions I mentioned have been satisfied. And because there is no, you can't go to Citibank, you can't go to the Fed, you can't go to any central authority to verify this, in order for there to be an incentive for someone to perform the mathematical computations necessary to determine that, in fact, these conditions have been met, are typically done through an addition of Bitcoin being what they call minted or created or mined in the transaction, so that the person who successfully crunches the numbers on their computer and is able to validate the transaction is rewarded by getting a certain incremental amount of coin issued to him or her. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling process, again, whereby the users of the blockchain are the ones who essentially, through their computers, are able to determine if a transaction is or is not valid, and all that's done without any government intervention. Yes?
What's going to happen when the maximum number of bitcoins have already been mined and are in the system? Then how will the sentinels or the validators be paid?
The answer is the same way. The difference is they will not obviously be able to mint or create new coin, but rather coin that is in the marketplace will be set aside and reserved for a return to them. So in other words, it will become a transfer of existing coin rather than creation of new coin.
So
There'll be a
effectively
tax on transactions?
I'm sorry?
It'll be a tax on transactions?
It'll be a tax on transactions, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Currently, the IRS is treating these bitcoins as a security and not a commodity or currency. Is that about right?
They are treating it as property. And the key there is not security. They're not treating it as, not as currency. They're not treating them as either securities, which is what the SEC is doing, or commodities, which is the CFTC. They're saying that they are personal property. So when you acquire a Bitcoin, you need to track the acquisition price, because then when you dispose of that Bitcoin, presumably by purchasing something with it, the difference will become taxable income to you. But it's taxable income as personal property.
Yeah, after validation, you mentioned distribution.
Mhm.
What is that?
Distribution is simply the last phase where then once the transaction has been validated, the coin is actually transferred. And that's a very good question, because the methodology of transfer is still something that is open to a lot of debate between different sources. It's a so-called hot wallet, cold wallet mentality. There are wallets, storehouses, effectively drives, that allow you to store your Bitcoin, that are both hot, meaning that they're online, stored in a cloud somewhere on the system, or cold, meaning you can keep them offline on a thumb drive, literally, or a remote drive that you maintain. And there's a lot of debate right now amongst the regulators as to whether both of those methodologies for distribution and storage of the coin should be treated similarly, should they be treated differently. So the concept of distribution, although it seems simple, once all the other conditions have been met, just distribute the coin, is actually still a very much open issue. The technology is there, but the regulators are really kind of working through what does it mean to effectuate and what do you have to do to distribute the coin.
Hi. I was in technology for 35 years with computers and computer code. So, and I saw, where I worked, we had a centralized system, and we had a group that understood what was going on in the system. And that was slowly over time replaced by a distributed system. And the end result of it was that there really wasn't people that really knew what was going on with the entire system, which I felt was not good. And in terms of blockchain, which is a distributed kind of technology, if I was a user of a blockchain currency, right, and I had a question, which people in my nation are going to be able to sit down with me and say, oh, this is what's happening in your computer, and that's what's happened over there, and that over there.
Blockchain has no help desk. To your point, if there's a question or a problem, most people are happy to go through their daily lives dealing with their banks and other finance companies, and really not thinking about it other than paying bank fees or other charges they may incur, except for the time when there's a problem. Money is stolen from an account, fraud has occurred, some other activity which requires intervention by somebody who has the authority. There's no such authority in the case of a distributed ledger, as you quite correctly point out. That's the purpose of it, is to eliminate that central authority. And so clearly, I think you've got two choices. Number one, the developers of the technology would argue that, well, this is designed to be used by adopters. If you are comfortable in a situation where there is no central authority, where there is no help desk, if you will, this may be a viable product for you. If you are not, perhaps the cryptocurrencies are not appropriate. The other approach is the one that the governments are taking right now, which is, well, maybe we should allow this distributed technology, but with a certain degree of government oversight. So that if you do have a problem or a question about whose computer is involved or are there issues, there could be a government agency that you could go to. Clearly, that was not the intent of the original developers behind the blockchain. But again, there's no reason to argue that because the currencies have evolved to a point and have become so widely adopted that the original intent, which again was really designed so that online gamers could pay each other for their electronic game winning and losings, was a very narrow audience. And there was no concern, I think, among them that somehow people would be using the cryptocurrency who didn't have faith in a distributed ledger. But today, to the extent that people have concerns about the wide dispersion and the lack of central control, it raises the issue, which is what governments are considering now, whether they have a role to step in and create some kind of centralization where the technology doesn't require it.
Could you explain the conversion process to government money from cryptocurrency?
Sure, absolutely. The conversion process is the same as you would see between two forms of government currency. If you hold dollars and you're preparing a trip to the EU, you go to your bank, you convert your dollars into euros, and you travel to Europe. In the case of the cryptocurrency, there are online exchanges where you can go and get a quote for dollars to Bitcoin, or yen to Ether, or for that matter, Bitcoin to Ether. You can convert from one form of crypto to another, and if you agree to the price that they're posting for you, you can use typically for most smaller transactions, again because it's online, payment is done through a credit card. For larger transactions, some providers will allow wire transfers as well, and you literally will remit your dollars to the bank of the intermediary that you're exchanging the currency through. That intermediary in turn then will remit, pursuant to whatever the wallet system is that you've got in place, the Bitcoin back to you. And it's a transaction that can occur not instantaneously, unlike Visa, which can process X number of million transactions per second. Currently, the technology with the state-of-the-art of Bitcoin today is Bitcoin can really only handle at maximum about 3 transactions a second. So it means that as a practical matter, if you want to convert your dollars to Bitcoin, it could take you 15 minutes online to actually get that transaction processed. But what would happen is you'd start out with the dollars at your credit card, let's say, and you'd wind up with a new expense on your charge card, but in return, you would have the Bitcoin then in the wallet that you had designated, whether it's an online wallet, as I mentioned before, the so-called hot wallet, or a cold storage wallet at your local computer, because the Bitcoin literally is just an algorithm that gets transferred then to wherever you've designated it.
Just in the map you had there with the different laws involved, one, I think it was 6 states, including Illinois, it said that no license is required if there's no sovereign currency involved. And can you kind of explain what that statement means, and within it, what the definition of sovereign currency is?
Sure, sovereign currency is government currency. Dollars, fiat currency.
Whether it's debt-based, bank-created money, or the little bit of sovereign money therein?
That's exactly right, because for purposes of the cryptocurrency world, there are 2 types of currency: government-backed or government-issued, if you will, and cryptocurrency. And so fiat currency, sovereign currency, there's no distinction. With respect to the cryptocurrency market, essentially anything other than cryptocurrency is going to be viewed as sovereign currency, for this purpose, at least with respect to the conversion between dollars, let's say in Bitcoin, which is traditionally where the governments have regulated. It's been your local currency exchange or your local bank that will allow you to transact in dollars that caused the regulation for most states in the first place. And so what they've done is, they've basically just taken their same regulations and said, yeah, we don't really understand this cryptocurrency stuff. But if whatever you're doing in cryptocurrencies involves the same dollars that you used to go to a currency exchange or to a bank to make a transaction, then we're going to assert regulatory authority.
I have two questions, one environmental and one political. The environmental is, apparently it takes a lot of energy to do the mining of these currencies.
It does, and it's taking a greater amount. As the number of currencies in existence increase, the amount of computing power that it takes to go through this validation process, this mining, goes up increasingly as well, which requires both a lot of computing power and hence a lot of energy.
So when the mining is over, for example, Bitcoin, because it has a maximum, the transactions themselves don't take much energy.
That's correct.
So the environmental impact is over that.
Or at least significantly reduced.
Yeah.
Now, of course, the trade-off for that is the reduction in the mining functionality, developers hope, can be offset by an increase in the transaction speed. So that if you can take the currently roughly 3 transactions per second that the Bitcoin technology is capable of producing and increase that by multiple orders of magnitude, you will start to have a currency that, at least in theory, can be actively traded and negotiated enough to become a viable product. But the question is, what will the computing power and the related environmental cost be to increase that transaction speed? And that's simply something the technology at present is not capable of answering.
The political question is, so I'm working with someone who was a trader in Chicago, and he's very much in favor of cryptocurrency. And I talked to him about sovereign money. He's a libertarian, and I'm more like a social democrat. And we're clashing over this. So my view is that cryptocurrencies are a great dream for libertarians because it doesn't involve government, if it is adopted one way or another as a currency. And for the social democrats, sovereign money is the dream because they have let's say, a more trusting view of government and what government can do. Now, I know that some people, I'm from the Netherlands, that they're thinking of, well, we can adopt cryptocurrencies underlying technology for sovereign money purposes. What's your view on that? Because I like to bring this a little bit back to sovereign money and the NEED Act and what the American Monetary Institute is about.
No, that's an excellent point, because although the Netherlands is probably at the vanguard, they're not exclusively in the camp of nation states that are today considering effectively issuing their own cryptocurrency. And it's a fascinating concept because, again, since the crypto market was designed to be governmentally agnostic with no role or functionality for any central authority, the government is just another participant as far as the crypto market is concerned. So if you wanted to go out and develop your own crypto coin with the appropriate technology, you can start one on yourself. Similarly, the government could do the same thing, and presumably, because again, the fact that it's issued by an individual or issued by a government would make no difference since there is no issuance. It's created. In the sense of cryptocurrency, it's not issued, which means one person who creates it is no better than anyone else and doesn't create any greater validity. So governments actually, they're considering creating their own cryptocurrency.